So today we're going to be talking through how we break into innovation and really start to figure out how to address the blockers that are causing us to delay and stagnate on being innovative, and really how we can look to use that innovation motion to get better adoption of new tools that are coming out, such as generative AI. So, and then we're going to get into where Insight can help and how we can help break through a lot of those issues in addressing legacy concerns and getting into the innovative state. So my name is Mark Candelora, and I'm a senior manager at Insight. My new role in portfolio is aligned with app modernization services.
And hey, everyone, I'm Carm Taglienti. I'm the Chief Data Officer and a Distinguished Engineer here at Insight, and I manage our portfolio around data AI. So I'll be talking to you about that as we go forward.
So first, we're going to start with why innovation, right? What is it? Why are we trying to be so innovative? And I think a lot of this is kind of well understood, but I think it's really going to serve to set the framework for what we're trying to talk about today. So we know that technology is changing more and more rapidly. There are metrics out there that say that innovation and technology is going to change more in the next 5 years than it has in the last 25, and that continues to actually scale. So the 5 years after that will again be more innovative and show more change than the 25 years before. And so how do we take advantage of that innovation and really change our organization in a way that's going to be able to take advantage of those innovations in ways that we never thought were possible in the past, right? And so a lot of that really gets around what are the things that we need to do in order to prepare ourselves for that change, right? And how to open ourselves up to being agile and drive change throughout our organization. So the final thing here is really that innovation is an organizational imperative. And we know that when organizations fail to change, that they are displaced, right? And usually that's through new organizations that come up, other organizations that are able to be innovative and take advantage of innovations that are out there, new tools and things that come out, end up swallowing up the organizations that are not able to adapt. And so we're going to start with the hypothesis here, right? And that really is that organizations, in order to really take advantage of a lot of the newer tools that are coming out, like generative AI, we first have to modernize our application and our data estates, right? And so in order to do that, we need to break through our legacy application and data issues. We need to arrive at a more modern state where then we're able to be very forward-looking in the way that we look at adopting our tools, right? And a lot of times that really means thinking outside of the box, not just in the way that, a tool is exactly that, a tool for how we might do something. But if we're not using that tool in the right way, we're not going to be able to really arrive at that innovative state. So really a lot of the being innovative is a cultural disposition where we want to be able to question a lot of the things that we were doing in order to make sure that we're able to be and adapt to the newer ways of doing things, right? And so the tools usually come later, right? We want to make sure that we're able to drive that culture through the organization in order to arrive at a innovative cultural state, and that innovation is ongoing, right? So in order to break out of where we are today with dealing with a lot of the day-to-day operations, the way that I look at this is that a lot of our teams, especially our IT and technical teams, they're 98 to 100% of their time is really focused on the day-to-day operations. It's supporting the applications that they have. It's going through the cost and budgeting concerns and dealing with security, tech support and all of those things that are really sucking up the majority of their time. And that actually leaves really little to no time to look at in doing the investment that's really needed in order to innovate, right? And so when those teams are, and you can see it on people's faces, right? When they're going from their desk to the water cooler, right? If they're looking down and they're toiling over, how they're gonna resolve some issue, and they're really focused on things like that. They're not really able to open themselves up to new ideas, right? And so in order to really get through that, we need to make sure that we're and adapt to more innovative things. We need to lower their focus on that kind of toil, right? And so really we look at doing that through things like modernization, where we're trying to lower the just by a couple of percent generally, right? Really look at reducing the amount of toil spent on technical debt, on an application goes down or has focus on DR or backups and things like that, and in the general support of an application, and really allow them just a little bit of available mental bandwidth to start to think about how they might expand or transform their organization and the work that they do day to day, as well as maybe even ideally supporting the way that they support their business units, right? And so this kind of transformation is really a conjunction of the way that your IT staff might be operating with the way that your business units are operating. And so this isn't necessarily just like a IT innovative thing. Ideally, all of these kinds of innovations and modernization effort comes from both the business side as well as the IT side. So in order to do that, we need to make sure that we're understanding how we want to get through that modernization effort, right? So in order to really be innovative, we have to break through the barriers for innovation, which in a lot of cases is reducing the legacy technology and really trying to adapt more modern approaches and strategies, as well as modern tools, right? So it's really hard to understand how we might do that if we just have a vision and we're just trying to aim for that future vision. So ideally, it's going to be going through some fairly rigorous planning around how we might what the vision looks like, right? Identifying what your superpowers are and focusing on those things and really reducing the effort that's required to get to that point, right? So maybe it's nobody goes into business to manage their infrastructure, their data centers, right? So sometimes that's shifting a data center into the cloud, and that removes a lot of the need to really focus on buying new hardware and maintaining networks and things like that. Now, not that goes away completely, but it's really reduced, and it allows your teams to focus more on delivering the value within their applications rather than focusing on all of the underlying technology, right? So then, looking at organizing your modernization efforts, and really we're looking at breaking that down from this future vision that can seem really far away, really hard to get to understand how we might take the very first step and maybe the next step after that, right? And so how do we measure the success of those modernization efforts? Well, we identify a core set of metrics, and then we publish some reports that where we're going to be able to track that progress towards the future vision over time, right? And so here you can see, we have reduced cost and improved ability to deliver. Those are examples of different types of metrics that an organization might have. But at the end of the day, we're trying to really track our progress against how we want to achieve that future vision in incremental steps, right? And so each step should really have a very specific finite thing that you're looking to do across your organization. So maybe you're looking to automate more of your infrastructure. So you might look to adapt Terraform in order to automate the updates to virtual machines. Maybe you're looking to get off virtual machines altogether and adapt cloud native technologies. And so those are smaller initiatives that you want to make sure that you understand exactly how they're going to impact the metrics and really impact your business all up, right? And at the end of the day, just because there is some technology out there that you're employing that's legacy doesn't mean that it needs to be modernized, right? Modernization for the sake of modernization is actually a really bad thing. And so if there may be places where something is legacy, but the importance of modernizing that, the impact of focusing on putting a lot of investment there is going to be relatively low. And so we want to reduce the modernization effort as we go through this process as well. So that's another key thing that we want to make sure that we're focused on investing in the areas that are going to really provide the most benefit. And the last thing here is just making sure that we're regularly reevaluating the direction that we're going and the path that we're on, right? And as things change, sometimes this is a 3, 5, 7 year journey, right? And so, over that time, things are going to change pretty dramatically. And so we want to make sure that the future vision that we thought we wanted to achieve, that's really still a viable vision, and the path that we're on is still likely to get us there, right? So once we've gotten through the modernization effort, we're starting to look at the innovation portion of that model that we were looking at, right? So innovation, in a nutshell, is how we commercialize and grow through the adaptation of new ideas, right? And so this is a very business-centric definition, and my view on it is that the innovation that actually happens in much smaller chunks than what this definition may suggest, right? So this definition really shows a very product-centric approach, where somebody has this big light bulb moment and suddenly they've got a new idea for a new product, and it's gonna be amazing, and we need to figure out whether that product is viable and is going to be, have market value. We're going to be able to make a profit off of it. Where really a lot of those ideas are actually quite old, right? Those ideas have been around for a while. It's just new innovations, new things come up in the market, in the world, that allow us to make the business model around an idea more sound, right? And so how a innovation comes up is not easy, right? It's very risky. Somebody has a new idea that is super innovative, and a lot of times it's going to fail because it's not able to be scaled. We're not able to make money off of it. Customers, it doesn't quite fit the need of what customers need today. And so it's really difficult to plan. It's frankly just very chaotic. And a lot of the times, every dollar that you spend on this kind of innovation often will lead to a loss, or at least not the full realization of what that new innovation is idealized to be, right? And so a lot of times that will companies will look at, well, we don't want to innovate because it's too risky. So, and our market area is so saturated and so mature that it's actually more risky for us to do any investment in innovation than it is just for us to continue to turn the screws the way that we are, reduce cost, and be more effective, and that kind of thing. And that's a really hard place to be in, but it's still really important even for those organizations to be innovative. So when we're looking to drive into innovation, we want to make sure that we're doing it in the right way. And a lot of times that means doing innovation from the ground up. So, your individual contributors, those are the folks that are going to have the most insight into the newer things that can be done. And we want to make sure that those individual contributors are able to kind of collide, right? That they're able to meet up and share ideas and really make sure that they are able to take advantage of each other's knowledge and each other's superpowers to drive more innovation, to figure out new ways of doing things, identify new tools that they can adopt to make potentially an old idea, an old product, really reasonable in terms of the way that you might bring it to business today, right? So the other thing that we want to make sure of is that when those ideas are being shared and thought through and whatever, that we have programs in place that that help drive those new ideas throughout the organization, right? And so a lot of times those can be things, smaller things like hackathons, or we at Insight actually we have a Shark Tank concept where different people throughout the organization will bring up ideas, bring it in front of leaders, and we'll vote on which ones get a certain amount of investment, and then we'll go through and invest in innovation like that. And a lot of times, those types of things are really great, but it doesn't really get a lot of emphasis unless there are leaders involved that are actively participating and helping to make that program a success. And so, in order to foster that as well, there also needs to be a culture of learning, right? And so as we're going through a lot of this, we talked before about how innovation is really risky. And so we need to make sure that we're leaning into that, right? Like we can't assume that every dollar that we spend in investment in these types of areas is going to be fruitful. Sometimes things fail. And so the idea here is to really try to reduce the impact of failure, right, and limit the amount of investment until we know that things are going to be beneficial. We want to validate the things that we need to validate first before we start to really scale and grow certain ideas. And so, in order to do that, we want to make sure that we have a plan for how we're going to do this, right, and we have a vision for what we're trying to achieve, and that vision is both, set in place from the top down, but also is incorporating those individual contributors that have really bright ideas, right? And so, how we do that, there's no science to it. There's no prescribed set of guidelines or activities where we can have our teammates going through this process. But at the end of the day, it's really it needs to be inclusive of everyone throughout the organization to make sure that we're not excluding areas where we can find innovation. And ideally, again, those areas, it can't necessarily be everywhere, right? We may not be able to invest all of our time in finance operations, right? In innovation there, right? That's not our superpower. Our superpower is in certain type of product development or manufacturing. And so we want to make sure that we're focused on how we're driving that innovation throughout the organization as well. So I'll skip the platitudes here, but really in order to make sure that we're driving innovative products into the market and we're identifying where those products can be the most effective, we have kind of these three areas that we need to juggle. And typically they follow a very specific cycle of how we might do that, right? Of how we might prove out these different areas, because each one has a different level of investment that's required in order to prove it out. So we're starting with the easiest thing to prove out first. And generally speaking, that's going to be the technology side of things, right? If you can come up with an idea and you can prove it out and make sure that you can show that it's actually a doable thing, right? That that your AI models can actually predict this outcome, then that's step one. Step two is going to be actually validating that that there is a product use out there for it, that your customers need this thing. And your customers can be internal, they can be external, but that's kind of the next level of investment that's really required to prove that out. And then the third here is the validation. And that's probably the most difficult part, right? Making sure that the investment that's required to make that product work in the market is profitable, right, for your business. And so organizations really need to step through this in a very logical fashion in order to make sure that you're not getting ahead of yourselves and you're not building up whole organizations around something that is really difficult to turn a profit on, right? And actually, entire organizations sometimes fail around that very concept, right? They fail to scale out to the level that they need to in order to make sure that the innovation that was imagined is actually a profitable and viable experience for the industry and for the company as well, right? So with that, I'll turn it over to Carm.
Thanks, Mark. That was awesome. So speaking of innovation, I want to talk a little bit about disruptive innovation as it relates to generative AI. So let's talk about a future with generative AI. If we look at the market just overall, we all know the popularity of generative AI, but in general, AI as well in terms of adoption, many organizations are looking at this from the perspective of how can we automate work activities that are taking up a lot of our time today? And so one of the use cases that we'll describe coming up is really focusing on how do we take advantage of the fact that we have this awesome capability to be able to do things like increase productivity related to, say, coding, for example, coding more effectively, or potentially even generating content or things for capturing or generating knowledge. So those are things that we'll talk about in terms of being able to maximize productivity for our employees. And then if we think about just in general, I mean, then this was probably true before generative AI, but more so now, the fact that if we look at automation, and there's been sort of a wave toward automation of activities all the way from the early days of RPA, for example. But between 2030 and 2060, half of today's work activities could potentially be automated. And so generative AI just helps to maybe even accelerate that further. And then we look at it in terms of labor productivity. Oops, sorry, back there for a second. Is it's really just, we start to see this ROI. And I'll talk a little bit about value realization, but this is really about taking advantage of capabilities that are made available to us through generative AI, through other AI capabilities and automation, and then really looking at it in terms of sort of maximizing that productivity. And we'll start to see ROI as it relates to that over time. So go ahead, Mark. All right, so what's the big difference about generative AI? And this is the innovation side of this. And so if we think about generative AI in general, it's a large language model. It's pre-trained, but it's trained on a massive amount of information. And so these models are trained on significant amount of, I'll call it curated data set, although the term curation is a little bit debatable, mostly because of the fact that the information that was gathered comes from Wikipedia and other sources that aren't necessarily, I'll call it, the quality of that data is not specifically known. It's not that it's unknown, but it's not specifically known. But in general, it's a large corpus of information, and that's how the models have been trained. But they have a broad pattern of prediction capabilities and arguably maybe some bias in that information as well. But in general, when we think about what is able to be done with these models, we know that it's amazing its ability to be able to generate human readable text as well as understand human readable text. And that's really the power of these models overall. And the reason for that is because the neural networks have been trained with these large corpuses of data. And what's the primary mechanism for making them quote unquote smarter? Well, it's more data. And so that's what we'll see, I think, over time. But in general, the models, because they were trained on broad set of data, they have pattern recognition, which is aligned to that data, which includes things like images, music, text, etc., which gives them large applicability. And we've also seen this as well. It's not just generating text, it's also generating imagery or speech or music. So again, super popular in terms of its applicability more generally. And then one of the things that is, again, most important about these environments is that they're democratized. So they're easily accessible. So the chatbot interface, for example, ChatGPT, made it simple for us to be able to access a large language model and take advantage of these capabilities. And then we also have the ability to tune them, if you will. So I'm talking about here fine tuning, which is really sort of training over the existing model set, it's called transfer learning, but it's basically a model that allows you to be able to inject intelligence into the model as it was trained, even though it was pre-trained on a specific data set. You can include your own. And then, of course, prompt engineering is the other piece where we call that embedding, which allows us to be able to customize it so that it can actually understand more recent knowledge or knowledge specific to your use case, whether it's personal use case or even corporate. And in most cases, we talk about the corporate use cases, but in general, you can also use it for personal reasons. But that's a great way to say, give context to the large language model so that it does understand what kinds of questions you're asking it. And it also allows the large language model to respond the way that you expect it to, given that information. And then, of course, I talked about accessibility, which I think is another big part of this. It's making it easy to use. And Mark was talking about innovation as it relates to the application innovation environment. And this is really no different. And so what we do as we think about application integration or intelligent applications, we can leverage these innovative capabilities around AI and intelligence and then embed them into our applications, making them more accessible in the general sense. And we'll see a lot of this, I think, moving forward. So next slide. All right, so what are some of the different use cases that we see here? And this large span of potential areas where we can invest. And many of these, we've already had conversations with customers. We've been talking to customers about these particular situations, and we're actively engaged in projects in a number of them. But I'm not going to read this all to you, but in general, you can see all of the different use cases. And the one thing that we have been seeing over time is the fact that there are so many more. So if you can think about anything that you could, qualify as a productivity enhancing type of initiative that involves in, any way, shape, or form, the generation of text or imagery or even speech for that matter, well, then yes, that could be a generative AI use case in those particular situations. So some things, for example, that we've been working on, well, code optimization is one key one. A lot of us have already been using those kinds of tools, Copilot, for example, with GitHub, to be able to generate code more efficiently or even start us off faster in terms of generation of our code. Or even things like if you think about risk analysis, for example, so identifying potential risk based off of, say, existing contract documents or documents that you might have already produced to understand, well, where's my liability? Where are my risks? We're doing some of this work internally. So there are many use cases that we can think about applying some of these amazing generative AI style capabilities. And clearly, they're not all listed here. So there are, I bet, even just looking at this, you can probably think of, 5 or 10 more as you think about some of the broad applicability of these capabilities. So next step. All right. So if we think about this in the context of sort of out of the box, integrated into applications, or even custom model approaches. So out of the box is really just sort of simple. We think about the modern workplace, Copilot. Microsoft is working on these today. So they're embedding it into the Office 365 platform. We can use it for learning and development, AI governance or centers of excellence, for example, or productivity, and then prompt engineering, as I mentioned. So there are lots of applicability just with sort of standard capabilities without building too much else into it. So it's really just providing the right data assets in order to be able to customize or set context for your large language model, and then be able to literally turn it on and start using it. What are some of the threats? Well, there could be things like application and code generation or end user support might be challenges, I think, that you might need to think about over time, trusting maybe some of the results. And even with this generative AI capability doesn't mean that everything that's generated we would necessarily trust, because we do have this concept of hallucination, which I won't get into too much detail, but hallucinations are just a fact of this particular generative world, where you do need to think about, have the large language model, or did it produce something that maybe is not probabilistically correct, but it's the best probability that it had. So that's what we really call a hallucination. You might say, well, it made an answer up, but in general, what it did do is it created a probabilistic answer. So you do have to understand at some level, what is the quality of response? And there are techniques that we have been working on, which are related to how do I measure that quality, which I think is an important characteristic of this as well. We can also integrate it into apps, as Mark and I have been talking about at this point. So it's really just AI-enabled applications, super popular. These are areas where you'll start to see a lot more of this in the future. Industry-aligned content, so subject area kinds of approaches where you can build intelligent context for particular types of applications. So literally training a model which is really associated with a particular subject area or domain, and then providing that as part of an integrated application. Custom integrations, of course, integrating to wherever your data source might be, real time, non-real time, or different types of systems that could provide data. And then focusing on things like, well, how are we looking at security? And this has been quite a big debate. Localized tenants, not sharing prompt information or prompt response information, for example. Those are some big key areas, but also worrying about things like, well, what about prompt injection? What if someone poisoning your response streams? It's sort of the classic examples of at any points of communication, as you think about the interaction, any one of those is susceptible to security threat. And so we want to make sure that we treat it just like any other application that we might use. There's also the concern within the large language model itself of things like bias, which is a slightly different thing that we would think about as well. And then custom models, well, at what point do you create your own custom models where you think more specifically about, I want to build my own model, or I want to build a model that is tuned specifically for my use case so that you can actually provide value directly without necessarily having to worry about creating a context which can support those kinds of solutions. And so we can get into things like recommendation engines or chatbots, or even, call center support systems where we can do speech to text or text to speech, where it provides us with a lot of value in terms of the application integration. And so lots of different use cases and lots of ways that we can think about it. And many of them are real innovations in the way that we think about taking advantage of this AI capability. So go ahead, Mark. All right. So many of you are familiar with the, sorry, losing my voice. Many of you are familiar with the standard machine learning models, but what we like to talk about is a generative AI lifecycle. So this is really just, how do I approach the problem of being able to solve my particular Gen AI use case? And so the first thing is we always start with the identification of the business challenge. So first of all, what's our goals? Why would we want to take advantage of these kinds of capabilities? So we start with the problem domain. Then we move into thinking about, well, what kind of model do I need in order to be able to support these particular kinds of challenges that you might be thinking about those use cases? Now, historically, what we would do is we would then start collecting data in a standard AI lifecycle. But now we want to actually look at the exploratory response analysis. So really just looking at, well, how is it going to respond? Is the model giving me the kinds of information that I'm looking for, or do I need to add additional knowledge to it? And if I start to think about how that works, then I can start to shape the types of knowledge that I might need. That's when I would get into this concept of large language model engineering. So I determine whether or not do I want to use embedding models, which I call model augmentation, tuning or training, which are the other techniques that I can use in order to be able to help solve the problem. There are pros and cons to both, and we won't talk about that in too much detail today, but in general, we want to make that decision. Then we would think about, how do we take the engineering approach to this? How do we build it into my engineering lifecycle? How do I sort of get in the CI/CD pipeline model in terms of allowing me to be able to deploy my solution in the most effective way? And then once I've done all that, test it. Does the approach meet our needs? Does it actually accommodate for all of the possible use cases that I might have envisioned up until this point? And then if it does, then it's ready for business use. And then finally, I want to be able to monitor the environment and determine efficacy. I talked before about hallucinations. So at what point do I then want to say, it's not quite working the way I expected it to? I might have to go back and repeat parts of the cycle in order to make this effective. So really, this sort of disciplined approach to thinking about the generative AI lifecycle allows you to sort of take those innovative ideas and then bring them through this life cycle in terms of being able to create a production-ready, supportable type of solution, and then, of course, iterate. So you then just sort of continue to build that pipeline. Mark was talking earlier about how do you sort of facilitate the cultural concept of innovation. This kind of a life cycle allows you to be able to do that relatively easily because you have an approach. It allows you to be able to take that approach and drive it forward, take those great ideas, and then embed them or embrace this concept of the generative AI lifecycle and then move them into production and then really take advantage of the value that it can provide to your organization. Next slide, Mark. All right, so I talked about a couple different areas of this. So the only thing that I'll just touch on briefly is there are different types of model building that we want to make sure that we understand. One is called retrieval augmented generation. And this is really where you bring your own data. So you basically use your own data to be able to embed it in the prompt so that you can say, using my data, this is the kind of response I'm expecting. And so this sort of sets context to allow you to be able to augment your prompt, to be able to give it the kinds of information that you expect in order to be able to answer your question or your prompt. Fine-tuning is the next one. So fine-tuning is really where I am very comfortable or understand exactly the kind of knowledge I want to build into the model. Now I can actually retrain a small part of the model and then basically include that in my model itself, or we like to call it baking it into the model, and that's called fine-tuning. So basically, this is taking anything that you would have done in retrieval augmented generation, but now sort of baking it into the model. And that's fine-tuning. It's not replacing the entire model. It's just taking parts of the model and then putting your knowledge into it. And then finally, there are companies that will look at tuning or training specific models. So if it's a very specific domain and you want to create your own model from scratch, you may want to do this as well. So this is the area where you're saying, I know I want to be able to create my own model to be able to support my very specific use case, healthcare or some industry vertical. This is one way that you might do it. And it's a little bit more complicated to do. Takes a little more computational power and support. But this is really, some organizations may want to do this, but those are the possible ways that you can build a model. Next one, Mark. And then deploying models. So we're going to think about, well, how do we deploy them? So cost is going to be a consideration, securitization of the model and understanding exactly how we're going to protect security of the model. And then, of course, how are we going to generate or understand feedback? Binary feedback, hallucination detection, or even chat retention history. How do we understand the responses were what we expected them to be? And those are all considerations as we think about it in terms of determining overall efficacy. And then on to the next one, operationalization. So deployment, this is where you recognize value. So you deploy it more generally across the organization. You can then look at concepts of, I'll call it drift in terms of the way that the model actually performs, and then ensuring that you can focus on understanding what the value of the model is and whether that value erodes over time. Man, I've been talking too much, I guess. Okay, and then how do I scale it through things like centers of excellence or broadening it out to community of practices as it relates to leveraging these innovation capabilities? Next slide. And then you can build this out. So this is basically, this concept is important for you to understand as well. In some cases, and I've already talked about this, sometimes you might just want to do AI, which is where you're using these capabilities without necessarily having to build it yourself. Oh, sorry, on the flip side, using AI. But on the doing AI, you may actually want to create your own. And I talked about how to create your own capabilities. And so really that's the distinction. Most organizations are probably going to be using AI, the capabilities that I was describing. Other organizations might think about building your own. And that's where you would really require, I'll call it PhDs or SMEs in this topic area, where you're able to build out your own, create your own models and your own sets of capabilities. Okay, well, that was kind of a whirlwind through data AI and generative AI and how this works more generally. But Mark's going to talk a little bit about where we can help.
So Insight brings a lot of capabilities to how we might approach these kinds of challenges, right? We talked about how modernization often is a barrier to getting towards innovation, and embedding the culture of innovation throughout your organization is really challenging. So we have a number of capabilities here, both these kind of top line capabilities around app innovation, modernization, data and analytics, user experience, where those are the areas that we might lead with, but there's a lot of these other kind of supporting capabilities that Insight has as well, in order to make sure that we're delivering these capabilities super effectively, right? So your product strategy, looking at all the things we talked about around innovation and making sure that it's well planned, the value is there, and how you're agile and able to really adjust to the changing environment that we all find ourselves in, right? Product solutions and change and training, making sure that your innovations and the things that are going on in your organization are not only being effectively communicated, but also being welcomed by the organization, right? And breaking through a lot of those cultural barriers that might come up. Quality assurance and DevOps, and making sure that we're operationalizing things in a really repeatable way, both in terms of quality as well as the automation, right? And making sure that our teams aren't spending hours and hours or days, weeks, sometimes doing the types of things, support and operations that really can be automated, right? We have the tools out there now; they're available, and there's a little bit of an art to setting it up in every organization. So we bring a lot of those capabilities, as well as then the kind of foundational security, governance, infrastructure, all of those things. That's actually kind of the heart of what Insight has done historically, and that is one of our main superpowers that we actually bring all up is this kind of infrastructural assessment and making sure that you're staying modern throughout the entire technology stack. So a couple of the offers that we have here around how we might get started here is a no-cost VM migration. So we talked a little bit about how no organization gets into, unless this is your superpower like Insight, no organization really gets into business wanting to do infrastructure, right? Often infrastructure is kind of the cost of doing business for, if you're developing a new product or you're developing an application, you need to have some sort of infrastructure. And so getting away from that or reducing that barrier in terms of how you do infrastructure really effectively is a really critical aspect to how we might modernize your organization. And so doing a VM migration, in this case, we're offering a no-cost VM migration of up to 150 VMs. These offers need to be qualified, and so we need to make sure that that your organization and your opportunity really fits the size of this offer here. But this is one of the starting points that we might have for getting through some of those initial barriers to innovation. The second one here is no-cost app modernization. Again, subject to qualification, but assuming the application and your organization really fits this offer. This is a 10-week program where we would take an application from the current state that it's in, wherever it's in, do a full assessment, understand what the future vision for that is, understand its value in the organization, and really look to go through a technical modernization of that application and drive new pilots of new technologies into the way that you might develop and maintain applications overall, and then testing and go live, right? And that's a frankly, in and of itself, that can sometimes be a major challenge with doing some of these modernization efforts. And so making sure that we're doing this really effectively in a step-by-step manner, that's what this offer is all about, and seeing where you go, right? In a lot of cases, this kind of modernization is a real challenge because no two organizations are the same. Even though you might have under the covers, you might have some similar problems. The people and the culture and the business are often very different. So the way that we might have to do this, there's a lot of learning involved. So this is one of the a really good way of getting started and figuring out, what can we learn next about, improving the way that we might modernize in the future. So we have a number of other fast starts and accelerators here around app modernization. You can see some of the playbook that we have, where we follow kind of a phased process for how we would approach scaled modernization. We have a number of data and analytics offers around AI apps, AI embedded applications, and co-pilots, fast starts. Co-pilot being maybe a bit of an overused term at this point, but just being that when you have an AI model that's sitting and operating next to a human within the context of an application, that's kind of considered a co-pilot, right? And so we're looking to help organizations develop their own co-pilots for how they might embed AI into applications. And then the final area here on the right is the app innovation. We have a number of different opportunities that and offers that we have for how we might get started around fast starts. I mentioned we actually have a program around hackathons and how we would bring a hackathon kind of recurring program to organizations and really look to drive more of that upfront opportunities around innovation and how we would then look to scale that out through the rest of the organization. So on to Carm for Copilot Fast Start.
Yeah, so in this area, so we offer AI apps and Copilots Fast Starts. So basically what this does is allows us to be able to get you up and running quickly. And so there's a typical approach that we would use. So whether it's for creating your generative AI environment and starting you off on some use cases that might be applicable, or in embedding them into your application domain, either one of those are areas that we can focus on. If you go to the next slide, Mark, it's the approach that we use is really, we first start with a strategy workshop, really just understanding what is it that you're looking to do, and it's very similar to the life cycle I was describing earlier. So basically understand the art of the possible, talk about those potential use cases, identify the ROI that might be associated with them. And then we will typically deploy an OpenAI accelerator, or we call it Lens for Gen AI, which is our accelerator. So we can actually deploy that and start to get you chatting with your data. So move quickly, so to get you into that art of the possible for the MVPs that you might have selected, and then start to think about, well, what are some of those other broader use cases that you might want to think through, like in the case of the application copilot. How are we going to integrate that into the applications? What are some of the user experiences that we might want to accomplish as part of deploying that into your applications? Then with number 3, we start to plug this into your overall, I'll call it your cognitive search environment, or start to bolster the data that's behind it. So we think about not only the approach that we might be taking, which is to create just a talk to your data chat environment, or maybe it's a Copilot integrated application, but then we start to build out the knowledge base that allows us to be able to create intelligence for the application or for your chatting environment, and then start to move you quickly into that area. And then finally, it's the develop the solution brief or even an MVP, which allows us to be able to move forward. And so as quickly as we might go in terms of creating, I'll call it a roadmap or set of activities, and also in generating an MVP, we want to make sure that we can get you to the enterprise level solution. So the enterprise level solution might be, well, here are all the things we want to do in order to be able to roll this out to the organization. For example, we did this internally within Insight. So we've rolled out our internal applications, or Lens for Gen AI, we call it Insight GPT, to 14,000 people within the organization. And so that's the kind of thing where you want to start slow, create MVP, understand what the actual use case is, determine the ROI, and then move it into the enterprise domain by applying best practices and principles and thinking about all those considerations I was talking about before. And these activities are meant to have you follow that process, to ask all those questions, to make sure that we understand the disciplined approach to being able to roll out a production application in this context. And so that's really what this is all about.
Thank you to our speakers for this session. If you have any questions or would like additional information, please visit our website, solutions.insight.com.